higher concentration of ash relative to others. It's also a very common landscape tree. So I know some of the folks said they do landscape tree work or are in charge of that for cities and municipalities. Some communities are going to have a lot of ash that was planted after Dutch elm disease wiped out a lot of elms. They planted it with ash, which until emerald ash borer came along was a great street tree. So that's going to be expensive for those communities that are highly stocked with ash. So just to touch upon the biology and life cycle, the adults are roughly a ½ inch long. They're dark metallic green. They fit on a penny. The life cycle generally takes 1 year to complete, but we know that 2-year development is very typical, especially at new outlier sites or newly established locations. And we get more rapid development of the larvae in high EAB densities or in stress trees. So even something like a winter storm breaking out part of the canopy, that's going to stress the tree enough that any larvae that are in that tree will develop in 1 year, more so than the tree right next to it that has an intact canopy. So the really destructive stage of the insect are the larvae that feed just under the bark. And the larvae begin feeding in July and most finish by October and November once it starts to get cold. And then they overwinter. And what you find is when you have high densities of emerald ash borer, you get these extensive galleries under the bark, and all the phloem tissue has been consumed, and it disrupts translocation of the water and nutrients within the tree, and you rapidly get tree mortality. So over the course of the summer, you may see that foliage becomes thin, ragged, starts to yellow, especially between now and mid-August. We'll see that in a lot of heavily infested trees. Canopy dieback progresses over the course of the summer, and all of our North American ash trees of all sizes typically die in 3 to 5 years once they become infested. And we have 16 native North American ash species. We only have 3 around here: black ash, white ash, and green ash, but we have a lot of other ash trees as you head south or out west, and those are important ecological riparian areas as well. So there are 2 main ways that emerald ash borer disperses. One is through the natural spread of the adult insect flying from one infested tree to the next tree. And the other one is people moving infested material long distances. So I'm going to give you a quick snapshot of what we know about each one of those. The natural flight and dispersal of the insect, we know that physiologically they're capable of flying almost a mile a day, and they can probably do that for a couple days in a row if they had to find the next nearest ash tree. But we know that in a forested situation, they don't biologically have the need to get up and fly long distances. They just need to fly to the next tree. And what we find is that the vast majority of eggs are usually laid within 100 yards of where the adult female emerges. So that's good. We can use that to our advantage in some cases. So the other way, with people moving material, infested material long distances, we know that pests of all kinds, invasive species, are readily transported as hitchhikers along trade pathways, which, when it comes to emerald ash borer, it's a wood borer. Any guesses what pathway is most common movement of emerald ash borer? You're thinking wood, you're correct. And it's not that much of a stretch, as you know. So this has resulted in the establishment of isolated satellite infestations of emerald ash borer hundreds of miles from Detroit. So we have a lot of different plant protection organizations, both locally, nationally, internationally, that set limits and regulations to try to limit this artificial spread of the pest. So just to quickly summarize the short and long distance dispersal of emerald ash borer, natural spread from the adult flight of the insect is less than 2 miles per year on its own, especially if there's ash present. We've done a lot of different studies. One of the studies that we've done covered, it was over 4 or 5 years, and we were monitoring dispersal of the insect in an area that was over 100,000 acres in size. So these are well-documented studies, and even in the largest infestation we had in that area, this annual spread was just over a mile, maybe a mile and a half each year. So natural flight isn't that far. Human-assisted spread, though, can move. You know, somebody with a pickup truck of infested wood can move this insect hundreds of miles in just a matter of hours. And we have quarantines, outreach, like tonight, and best management practices. Those all help to reduce the frequency of this long-distance dispersal event occurring. We know from some economic analyses that we've done, the longer that we can keep emerald ash borer confined to its original infested area, it makes a lot more sense economically than just letting it spread willy-nilly across the state. You know, you're going to have a lot of stakeholders are going to be impacted all at once. You're going to have a lot of municipalities that are going to be impacted all at once. That's going to affect everybody's, you know, the town budgets for removing material or trying to treat trees or replant trees. And if you can stagger that out over many years, it's better economically for all of us. And we did a study where we were looking, this was back like 10 years ago, where we knew emerald ash borer was, and we decided what would happen if we could limit the spread of the infestations that we knew about in 2009. Not eliminate the spread, but just limit it. And what we found was that over the course of 10 years, it could save the study area, which was the eastern half of North America, up to $700 million in a decade. So it's worthwhile taking some steps to try to slow spread and keep emerald ash borer infested areas as small as possible. So with that, that's, I believe, all I've got. And I'll move it on to the next person. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, if we can, we'd like to hold off questions until the end. So hopefully you've got better memories than I do, so you can remember your question, and then we'll have a fair amount of time toward the end. You know, you may be thinking, you know, Vermont's been surrounded by EAB for a number of years. Has the Vermont just been standing, you know, sitting on our hands, not doing anything? And that is not the case. We've had a Forest Pest Advisory Committee made up of all the members right here that they're meeting on a quarterly basis to have a plan in place, an action plan, once EAB was detected. And of course, we've been implementing that. And to talk a little bit more about that is Judy.
Hi. Thank you. Arrange my belongings here. I'm really good with technology. All right, so I mentioned I'm the state entomologist and I work with the Agency of Ag. And I'd like to acknowledge my colleague Barbara Schultz, who works in the Agency of Natural Resources, who's been a great help and leader during this whole process, and from whom I stole many of my slides. What happened to the slide that was before that? Okay, somehow they got rearranged. So the initial find of emerald ash borer in the state of Vermont took place this February when an alert forester updating a UVA or current use plan saw the signs and symptoms on a tree. And he knew those signs and symptoms because he had attended a Forest and Parks Forest Health meeting where someone gave a talk and he was out in the woods and he said, wow, that looks just like it. And he reported it to vtinvasives.org on their Report It site, sent us the pictures, and Gwen, who's back here somewhere, sent around the email with the photos to all of us with a little note that said, oh no. So, once we found it, or rather, once we knew it was there, we went out and collected a specimen, and we had to send those off to the USDA. Any new find of a federally regulated pest has to be officially confirmed by a federal identifier. So we did that. That gave us about a week to sit around and wonder what we were going to do. So we decided that, sorry, this might be another thing that got out of order. the best thing to do would be to figure out where it was, at least in the immediate area, and we thought that a visual road survey would be the best thing to do. And we had a lot of help and cooperation from our USDA partners, particularly Nate and the Forest Service, who provided us with a number of maps of each town that we were going to look at with square mile grids on them, so we could go and send inspectors out on routes looking for the emerald ash borer. And keep in mind that we had a giant snow dump right when we were trying to do this. That was not helpful. So some of these towns, you might realize, have a lot of remote areas where there are no roads. So we sketched out routes and checked out what we had. So the idea was to have crews go out and actually get out of their vehicles and look at ash for at least, or rather for no more than 15 minutes per square mile grid. And then if they thought the trees looked like they might have emerald ash borer, then they would note it on their handy little iPads, and we would send a follow-up crew. So thanks to the brilliant technological minds at the Agency of Natural Resources, we had these handy little pads, and we could keep track of each grid that a crew went to, what its status was, whether we had to go back and follow up, whether that follow-up took place, and whether we had to go in and do destructive sampling, which would either be peeling a tree or cutting it down and looking at it. In the course of this roadside survey, an infestation in the town of Barry was discovered. So these are just some data points that we have from there. So a total of 11 towns were surveyed. What we were trying to do, you'll see on this map the towns in red are ones where infestations have been detected, and the original ones we were looking at are these four in Barry, Groton, Plainfield, and Orange. So we went to all the surrounding towns and did this visual survey. So at that point, we had a sense of where the insect was, at least in the immediate area, and the next step was to figure out what to do. Did we want to do a 3-county quarantine? Because, of course, these towns were at the juncture of 3 counties, Caledonia, Washington, and Orange. Or did we want to just do the default step, which was let Vermont become part of the federal quarantine, which is known as the Great Big Quarantine, which encompasses, at the time, the 32 states and 3 Canadian provinces. So we ended up, after some discussion, deciding to go with a statewide survey, and the quarantine implications of that, Tony will talk about more. So having decided that we would quarantine the whole state, we did want to do something to control the spread of the emerald ash borer and curtail the movement of ash, especially during the flight season, which is May 1 to October 1. And to do that, we created a sort of 2 zones. This is called the fried egg in technical language. The yolk of the egg is a 5-mile radius from known infested points, and then there's a 10-mile radius from known infested points. And so pretty much everything within that orange square is highly likely to be infested with emerald ash borer. And in the larger ring, it's likely to be infested or about to be infested due to the natural movement of the pest, plus the unnatural movement, thanks to the rest of us. So there is a set of recommendations for curtailing the spread of these pests. So that was, we then went to the Agency of Transportation, and they were extremely cooperative and provided us with these scary-looking signs, which really helped raise public awareness. How many of you saw those signs at all? Okay, so that was to try to give people a sense of where these rings of infestation were. So anytime you're wondering where is the insect now, or where are the known infestations, you can go to our website, btinvasives.org. Notice how I'm laying claim to this website. It's actually run by the University of Vermont and by Gwen and Meredith back there. And it's updated frequently, so that would be your best source of information. And also all the information about the recommendations and anything you want to know about EAD. You've
There's plenty of free stuff over on the table that has the website on it, so feel free to take something with you.
That's right.
And you don't have to write it down.
Swag. So the next question that we had was, where else is the emerald ash borer? I mean, we had done a visual survey around the known infestations, but it seems quite likely that it may be in other places, high-risk areas like state campgrounds or the state forest, which would be at risk from the introduction of EAB through firewood. And so we decided to put up trap trees, and this was actually based a lot on your advice, right, Nate? So a trap tree, you find an ash tree, you girdle a portion of the stem, and that's very attractive to the emerald ash borer. Then we'll go back in the fall or winter and cut the trees down and peel the bark off and see if any of the insects have found their way to those trees. So that's a helpful but labor-intensive tool. And the other thing that, and this is really being done by Forests and Parks, they're adding these informational signs about emerald ash borer if people encounter those trees. So this is a more detailed map of those state land areas where the trap trees are going to be placed, and it's shown in perspective with the infested area designations. So I showed you the one yolk fried egg, but after we found the insect in Montpelier, we made the double fried egg. The additional method we're using to try to find, or an additional method we're using to try to find the EAB is from you all, people with sharp eyes who are out there, or concerned homeowners. People can report it on the vtinvasives.org website. Some people talk to their foresters. We have a national hotline. So those of us involved in this meeting, for example, are the ones who are running out and trying to talk to landowners and determine whether those are emerald ash borer or not. So those are helpful tools. And in addition to which, we continue to do the purple traps for emerald ash borer. So we have had several new finds locally, I should say, in the New England region. As we were running around trying to figure out what to do with emerald ash borer, there was that New Brunswick infestation, and so Nate went up to Maine, and he found the Maine infestation. There's also been a detection in North Adams, Massachusetts, and that has an effect on Vermont because, if you use that 5-mile radius from the known infested points, that brings highly likely to be infested into Bennington County and those towns. And that just happened, so we haven't done a lot here yet. So the current status in New England is that a portion of Maine and a portion of New Hampshire and Rhode Island are not known to have emerald ash borer infestations. We've joined the Great Big Quarantine, and so Tony will tell you more about what that means about moving ash product around. And then this map shows you the sort of infested areas and affected towns. So then I would just like to thank, again, this has been a really wonderful interagency cooperation between state and federal entities. And I have to say, I appreciate the help everyone has given. All right.
Thank you, Judy. I appreciate that. And I do want to just stress one more time to answer your question, where else, how are we trying to detect? We're really relying upon you folks. So much of our effort is in information and education, making people aware, what are the signs and the symptoms of failing ash trees? What should landowners, forest landowners, what should consulting foresters, mills, loggers be looking for out in the woods? And because all these efforts are really, most of the detections come from you folks, not from the experts. So we want you to be always observant, looking for those signs and symptoms, telling your neighbors and people you meet about those, and then using vtinvasives.org as a means or contacting one of your local foresters to go out and take a look. So Judy mentioned about the big quarantine, and Tony's here to be that big federal guy to talk about it.
All right, so this does say Steve in the Valley. My name is Tony Stoloff. I'm guess I could use the microphone, huh? We're going to talk about what the quarantine is, what authority do we have to even implement the quarantine, any components of that. Try not to stand in front of you. Talk about what a regulated article is and how you can move that. Talk about compliance agreements and any associated permits, what are our approved treatments that we could do, and additional contact and information. So just real quickly, like you've seen from all of us here, it's not just USDA coming in and drawing a yellow line around everything. There's been a lot of cooperation between the states, Forest Service, and the 2 state agencies. We have the authority through the federal Emerald Ash Borer Quarantine Act. That's Code of the Federal Regulations, that's CFR. And I have acronyms for days, so if I use them, I apologize. But that provides us with the authority to conduct any regulated activities. And also the Plant Protection Act, and that's primarily for interstate movement. And that's just a picture right now of what it looks like for the quarantine, like Judy mentioned. Anything in the yellow surrounded by red, that's part of the federal quarantine, so any articles are limited. Again, I'll talk about those real quick. Components of a quarantine, Judy talked about the survey. She did mention the purple panel traps, and that's something the USDA contracts that out. So if any of you have driven around and seeing those traps, and if you've seen them down, let me know, because that's kind of my job, is to make sure those are in the trees. So I would love to know. Regulatory, that's pretty much USDA, but also any state regulations that might apply. And management, again, the whole point is just to control the spread of the pest. And that's all of us. And Sam will talk about the best managers' practices. Regulatory work, again, the whole point of this is to stop the artificial spread of EAB. We've established the quarantine. We showed you the map. It's several states. It's the entire state of Vermont, portions of New Hampshire. And that's where it'll get some of what we do comes into play, is particularly between Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, areas that are outside of that quarantine. Some of the things I do, we issue and maintain compliance agreements. I'll tell you what that is. And also outreach and education, which is pretty much what we're doing here today. And I do take a lot of calls as far as suspects, so that's a lot of what we do. Regulated articles. This is probably the most important point. Any stages of emerald ash borer, so if you've got a larvae, a pupa, adult, if you've got any hardwood firewood, you have logs, you have green lumber, you have stumps, branches, debris, anything, wood chips. All of those things are considered a regulated article and are subject to additional regulations as far as movement, and we'll go over what you can do and what you can't. And we also have a provision that any article, in addition, if it's deemed a risk, so I haven't run into this, but if you had a box and it was full of ash borers by some method, or it attracted them, I could say that was a regulated article and you couldn't move it. And this is pretty much the most simple way to say it, is if you are within that federal quarantine, that big yellow map, you don't need any federal permits from me or my coworkers or anybody in USDA, no compliance agreements. However, one thing you want to consider is there's state laws that can supersede that. So if you think you want to move item X from the north to the south, you should probably make sure you check with Judy or Barb Schultz to make sure that's okay. And as far as movements from the quarantine zone out of the quarantine area, that's where our agency comes into play the most, and we'll go through some situations like that, but particularly forest product industries that want to move things into New Hampshire, they want to move it to Maine, they're going to need a compliance agreement and they're going to need permits to do that. It's not just move it whenever you want, but we have the ability, so that industry isn't hamstrung. And a compliance agreement, essentially that's just an agreement between the USDA and a company. It's signed by a private individual, and that allows those articles to be moved. Again, the point is to facilitate commerce, yet mitigate risk at the same time. That's just a one-page document. You're not going to be able to read that, obviously, but it's pretty simple. It's pretty direct. You list what you want to move. We select the appropriate treatment if there is one, and you agree to do that, and you'll be able to move those articles. Approved regulatory treatments. A good example that we run into is folks in the forest practice industries, products industries. If you have logs, raw logs can only move from a quarantine to a non-quarantine during the non-flight season. However, if you wanted to remove the bark and an additional half-inch of wood, then you could potentially get an agreement and be able to do that. You can do kiln sterilization and that's typically your lumber. Methyl bromide, that's probably not going to happen in Vermont, but that's something gets done to a lot of logs that get shipped overseas. Again, I don't know of any facility here that does that, and it probably won't happen. Heat treatment is also one of our accepted treatments, and that would be probably your firewood. So we certify firewood kilns, and that way you can move those products throughout. And chipping, I've done a lot of that lately. There's been a lot of people that move wood chips from Vermont into New Hampshire, and that's really where we come into play, assuring that those chips meet our guidelines. And like it says, if you can get that down to 1 inch and 2 dimensions, then that product is deemed safe and you can move it. And wood packing material, I haven't run into any of that, but if you do have or know anybody that does ash packing material, that's also something that would have to be heat treated. As far as any nursery stock, there's no options for that right now. That's just a quick example of our permits. If you've got a treated article, you're going to get a 540, we call it, and that indicates that you've treated that article so that it is no longer a RIF. If you did not treat the article and you have logs, again, that would be something that you could only move during the non-flight season, and it would have to, wherever it was going, would have to go someplace that was also under agreement with us that they would take care of that properly, and that is during the non-flight season, October 1st to May 1st. Again, I want to just do another quick shot of the quarantine. Essentially, if you're in the yellow, you don't need any federal regulations. However, don't forget the state regulations. If you want to move out of that area, then you would need an agreement and permits from us. What you do, you want to know what the signs look like Nate and Judy mentioned. You want to know how to identify ash damage as best you can. So if anybody potentially does want to move something and you see that, you want to make sure you have taken care of. Contacts, we have the hotline. BT Invasives has a thing set up. And if you see any of the purple traps, they have signs, and I believe that is the same phone number, but I could be wrong. But if you do want to move anything or know anybody that does, you can contact me, or anybody up here can get you in contact with me, and we can figure it out. And I think any additional emerald ash borer info you want, you can get from that site. And USDA aphis.gov site, that'll get you to who I work for, or for anybody that has interest in any plant products. It doesn't have to be just ash stuff. If you want to move anything, essentially, I would go there. So that is all I have.
Great, thank you, Tony. So we heard Nate initially talk about both the economic and ecological benefits of slowing the spread of emerald ash borer. And then we talked about this big quarantine. Well, when we knew that Vermont only had EAB now in 5 towns. So the thought is, well, why if it's economically and ecologically appropriate to try to slow the spread, why is Vermont going with a statewide quarantine? Well, the reason is we feel that we can focus our efforts with these slow the spread recommendations by focusing on those 5 towns where we definitely know emerald ash borer is found, and really focus on working with landowners, forest landowners, and the forest products industry to try to reduce the movement outside of those zones with these recommendations. And we have a number of handouts, and next up, before we open it up to questions from you folks, is Sam Lincoln, the Deputy Commissioner, that's going to talk a little bit about the slow the spread recommendations.
Thank you all. Thanks for coming tonight. When the decision was made that we were going to be and have Vermont and the whole state quarantined, we wanted to, as Steve outlined, we wanted to focus our resources directly at where we knew emerald ash borer was, and how to slow that spread. And so a lot of folks across the front of the room here and others that aren't here, we worked together to take the recommendations that other states had used successfully. We essentially cherry-picked from various other states around the country and developed lists of recommendations for various sectors that might be involved in handling, harvesting, moving, salvaging ash. What we wanted to do was to be able to protect the resource and at the same time facilitate safe trade or movement of ash. There's a lot of considerations for utilities. They have a lot of ash in the right-of-way, municipalities on the roadsides, the forest products industry, with 4 to 8% of our forests made up of ash trees that if we needed to find a way that we weren't going to shut down all hardwood harvesting and how to make those recommendations for those various sectors. And so we have, as we've pointed out, there's hard copies here. I'm old school, believe in paper and a little technology too, but we have hard copies, and on VT invasives they're there. But we've been working with, we have recommendations for the forest products industry, for forest landowners, forest managers, homeowners, the municipalities, arborists, and tree care contractors. And we've been doing outreach to each of those sectors to explain to them exactly what these best practices are and how to apply them to the infested zone, and to limit the possibility that it would spread, to slow the spread. And when we, from a lot of hands came up here as forest landowners, and likely that many of you have ash in your forests, and that's why you're here. And if you have harvesting that needs to be done, for example, that we have outlined steps that your forester, your logging contractor can manage your land, but the forester can make decisions that are appropriate for the long-term health of your forest, and as we talk about sometimes considering your post-EAB forest. If ash products are to be moved off your property during a harvest, we've established best practices, recommendations for the logging contractors, the truckers, the mills, the people that will be receiving those products, that they know where they're coming from, they know the best time of the year to move them, the optimal time. So we have all those, and if you have specific questions about those sectors, I'm not going to go through them each line by line, but if you have questions specifically, we'll use the time afterward here to do that. So that's generally a really brief overview of our Slow the Spread effort and what it's about. And thank you all again for coming tonight, and I'll be glad to answer questions.
Oops, sorry, Emily. So you may wonder why we're using a mic in such a small room, but we have Scott from the Agency of Ag that's actually live streaming this, so that's why we wanted to have our voices recorded. And so when we go around asking questions, Danielle's going to carry the mic and ask you to speak into that so that it's part of our recording. So with that, I guess we'll open it up for questions. As Sam said, we have all these recommendations, and if we went through them, we'd run out of time. So instead of just kind of basing it on the audience and what questions you have, this is the time for you to ask those. We've got our resident experts up here, and Barbara, I guess I'd ask you to come out front as well. Barbara Schultz, that Judy mentioned, who's our Forest Health Program Manager with the Department of Forest Parks and Recreation. So we've got a group up here, and I'll do the best I can trying to decide who might be the best person to respond, but somebody will kick me if I'm wrong. So with that, I'll open it up. I know you had a question earlier. Why don't we start with you?
Can you tell us anything about the movement period when the active period? Does the ash borer infest a number of trees? Do they go from one tree to the next tree and that's it? So if you have a property with some ash on it, can you expect that if you've got one tree that's infested, that all be infested by the end of the period?
Yes, that's a good question. I would say that this year in In Vermont, emergence happened between mid and late June. So the adults started to come out of the trees just a few weeks ago. Probably peak emergence probably happened around the 4th of July. And now we're going to have kind of a few more beetles kind of trickling out over the course of the summer. But what the adults, once they emerge from the tree, they have to go up and nibble on some ash leaves. And just nibble on the margins of the leaves. It doesn't affect the tree health at all. And they do that for a couple weeks before they become sexually mature. And then they mate and start laying eggs. So we don't normally see eggs on the trees in the current year until mid to late July. And then you get tiny larvae and they feed. Now, whether they stay on the same tree or not, sometimes we see that the adults will emerge, the female will emerge from the tree, and she'll just crawl up to the nearest branch, nibble on some leaves, become sexually mature, the males will find her, and then she'll come and walk back down and find some furrowed bark on the same tree and start laying eggs. So sometimes you can have a tree that's pretty heavily infested right next to a tree that barely has any larvae on it at all. And you see the same dynamic happen in a forest woodlot where, you may have trees over the next few years, a whole range from trees that still look healthy to trees that are stone dead from emerald ash borer. And it's because they're getting attacked at different times and the population density is building up kind of on those individual trees at different rates. I'm working in a site now in New Hampshire where I'm monitoring over 2,500 ash trees, all different size classes, and we see that some of those trees have been dead for the last couple of years, and some of the trees look like they are not infested. I'm actually in the process, today was my day off of not being in the field peeling logs, but I'm in the process of peeling some of those trees that look healthy and seeing what the density is, and they're certainly infested. They're just not infested at the density that some of the other trees are that are further in decline.
Next question.
I have a 80-acre woodlot in current use in Calais, so I'm highly worried about this. And I have I have a lot of ash trees. I have a lot of trails up there, and I take a lot of firewood out. And I know a lot about bugs, but I'm curious about the flight habit. I mean, different bugs have very different flight habits, and I don't know whether if they're flying around up at the crown of the tree, nobody's going to see them, but possibly if you're looking, for somebody who's just a amateur entomologist or somebody who spends a lot of time in the woods, how can you possibly see them? Would you see them ever on the ground, or you can only see them on the bark of the tree? And then the other question that I have that's corollary to that is if you know how they fly, because different insects fly in very different ways. So if I see something flying around, is there a pattern or a flight cadence or something that would sort of alert me to what it is?
Looks like it's another Nate question.
No, those are good questions, and we've learned a lot about emerald ash borer. When we found it in 2002, we didn't know anything about it globally. It's such a rare pest in Asia that for the first couple of years we were trying to figure out the biology, how long it took to develop, how to develop traps and survey methods, because of we didn't know anything about the flight. What we found is that they're not great flyers. I mean, they can fly up to a mile a day if they were forced to. But generally, they just want to get to the nearest leaf, nibble on some leaves, and they kind of move about in a very small area, feeding on leaves and then laying eggs. Some we know will get up and fly a little bit further. We've seen that in some cases where we've done the research on this, that some females will fly and bypass perfect ash trees and get up to a quarter mile away and start laying eggs. So we do see some movement like that. They fly during the day. They don't fly a lot. Usually, if you find anything, they're up in the canopy of the tree. That's why they're very cryptic. Although they're bright and shiny green, they're actually hard to find unless you fell a tree or find an edge tree that has a lot of foliage all the way down to the ground and usually what you may see are males flying up and down looking for females. But that's really the only time you might run into it. You very rarely find them on the ground. Usually you get a lot of other green insects like tiger beetles and things like that that are on the ground and fly off when you walk toward them. And those are commonly mistaken for emerald ash borer. But generally, the way they fly and the fact that they are up in the canopy of the tree most of the time, and the individual beetles are really only around for a few weeks. So as it gets later in the summer, we still have a few beetles around, but not high densities of them.
Great. You did also mention being enrolled in the UVA current use program, so maybe, Keith, if you could mention a little bit about how we're working with landowners and consulting foresters.
Sure. So many landowners who have ash on their property are rightfully very concerned and wondering what the right response is given the threat to their forest land. And the concerns range from how do I protect my ash trees to how do I realize the value of the ash before it dies. And there are a lot of right approaches on a given forest land, and the right approach depends on a whole bunch of variables. What the objectives of the landowner are, what the condition of the ash is on the property, what the condition of the rest of the forest is on the property, what the proximity to emerald ash borer infestation is. So there's no right answer or single answer to provide to anybody for that. There is a policy, I don't have the handout here, that points towards the considerations that we do have for properties enrolled in UVA where somebody is going to be responding to emerald ash borer. Largely it holds the principles of UVA in place. It's basically manage your forest well, manage for the long term, and articulate what the objectives and goals are and how you're going to achieve them. The thing that we're really stressing in response to emerald ash borer is don't lose sight of the long-term health and vigor of the forest. There are ways to respond to emerald ash borer that both protects the health of the forest and can support the realization of some of the value of the ash that a lot of folks have worked hard to develop over the years. So if you're enrolled in current use and you're thinking about adjusting your management approach outside of what the current forest management plan says, then you can amend your forest management plan. Before you change your approach, get that management plan amended and approved by the county forester. I would encourage anybody to reach out to their consulting forester or their county forester if they're looking to explore what the right approach on their property would be.
Thank you, Keith. Next question.
I guess this is the first meeting I've been to where the purpose is to learn how to cover your ash. Anyway, I've got a couple of questions. Is there any chance we could get maps of the individual affected towns with points indicating on the maps where the detections took place, thereby enabling a person to look on the map and say their property was right beside one of those points or some distance away? My second question is, I think it was on the invasives. One of the emails I think circulated by Gwen that referenced something on the invasives website, but I saw a video regarding someone who was grafting some ash trees and making some which I believe were considered to be EAB resistant. I wonder if anybody has any update on that. And the last question I have is there any way, if you've got an infestation way up in a tree, how do you tell, other than, maybe the foliage is thinning a little bit, but how do you tell for sure that there's an infestation without climbing up and looking for holes? Thank you.
Well, Barbara, I dragged you up here, so I think it's your turn.
Yeah, I'll try to tackle these, got to start on these anyway. Question number one was about the locations of emerald ash borer. And we do have the map on VT invasives that shows you the area, and the center of those circles is where the known sightings are. They are, the circles are radius around the known sightings. But what we've already said is we know it is in a lot more places. And so that's the way we're distributing that information is through the circle. Those maps, as of today, I'm not sure you can download them to your computer yet in terms of getting them on your own geographic information system, but that's going to happen in the very short term. So you will be able to get those circles down as soon as we put them up there, which we're doing as we find new spots. The reason we're not publicizing individual spots, and you can be sensitive to that, is they're on private property, and so I think you can be sensitive to the fact that that's a sensitive thing for folks. What the second question was, there was about. Okay, yes, about grafting. I'll get to grafting, but Keith just reminded me that that this is also on A&R Atlas. For those of you who are familiar, the Agency of Natural Resources has an online atlas with lots of different layers, and it includes parcels, property boundaries. So it's a way you can compare these shapes, these circles, to your property boundaries. About the grafting, yes, I'm referring to the fact that there is research being done on developing or trying to look into trees that may have some resistance to emerald ash borer. Emerald ash borer is a very effective killer, and it kills 99% of the trees. It kills 99-point-something% of the trees. But there have been surviving trees even where emerald ash borer has been for a long time. It's very promising. Remember, we only know about emerald ash borer for 14 years, so there's a lot of research that hasn't been done yet, a lot we don't know, but it's promising that not every single ash tree has died everywhere. So even if it's a very small percentage, that's a ray of hope, and researchers have worked with some of these surviving, and the species that's been worked most with is the green ash species, but there's reason to think it might also be true for the other species, and have determined that the trees that survive emerald ash borer, if you take a graft from those trees and take the tree that results from that graft and challenge it with an emerald ash borer insect, that those trees actually can kill some of the emerald ash borer. Some of those surviving trees have an ability to kill emerald ash borer that does not survive and complete its life cycle. It's the very beginning of opening a door, opening a window, but it gives us hope that by continuing to work with developing resistance in ash trees, we might have something to work with, and it's a reason for us to be not kill all the ash trees ourselves. So is to not do the job even better than the emerald ash borer would do it, and to be regenerating ash and keeping ash standing as long as we can. And your third one was about detection. The very hard thing about emerald ash borer is how hard it is to detect. That's why it is spreading so well. Because it is very hard to see. And time and again, this latest detection in North Adams, Massachusetts, so very close to southwestern Vermont, once again, it was a situation where emerald ash borer had been there 3 years at least. And once again, people are looking, and it's just very hard to see. And that is why it's so very, very hard. So I wish I could say, and that it's trite to say closing the barn door after the cows are out, but we keep and people have tried very, very hard to keep this thing from moving, and yet it always seems to be a step beyond where we are, and that's the truth of the matter. And I will let Nate. Is there anything additional that you think needs to be added to that answer? Okay.
Great. I think the woman in the back had her hand up. Yes, sorry. The middle. Well, I was going to say gray hair, but I didn't want to, point it out.
Okay, I'm going to handle that. I am a simple homeowner, live actually just up the hill on an acre with a tree line between me and the farm field behind, with some huge couple of ash trees and maple trees. What specifically should I be looking for, and are there any preventive measures?
fortunately, I get to use the work of others yet again to save myself. So we have this display brought by folks at UVM, and so one of the things you can look for, if you can look under the bark, if you see bark splitting or a wound on the tree, look for the galleries, the infamous snake-like larval tunnels. You also might want to grab these little cards because they show some of the identifying features. The D-shaped exit holes are kind of tricky sometimes, but if you see a D-shaped exit hole, do get in touch with us. You can look for declining ash, although ash decline for many reasons, not just emerald ash borer. So there's, sorry, I was forgetting I'm addressing you. A suite of things you can look for. If your ash look unhappy, go look at them. Look to see if the bark is splitting or cracking. You know, look for exit holes.
These things are 100 feet tall.
Well, just look.
I can only see 8
Right.
feet.
Just look right there. And then the other thing that you can look for that you can see with a naked eye is sometimes woodpeckers go after these insects and they'll leave shallow woodpecker holes, not the giant pileated woodpecker ones, but small pecks about an inch deep because they're just going to where the insects are, right under the bark. And they also, their feet knock off some of the bark, so we call them flecks and pecks. So you're just looking for little blonde patches on the trunk of the tree. That's a good sign. But you know, the woodpeckers haven't necessarily found them, or the woodpeckers could be going after something else. Like Barb said, they're difficult to detect. And if you're not sure and you think it might be, then contact us, because we'd rather, you know, look at ash and talk to you about them and say, yeah, we don't think that's it, but it could be. Does that help? Oh, epicormic growth, right, how could I forget? Thank you, Patty. Epicormic growth is another good sign, and in fact, I believe that's how Barb found it in Montpelier. She was staring at a tree, an ash tree, and said, ooh, look at that. So epicormic growth is when you get sort of small little branches growing from down on the trunk where you wouldn't expect to see them. The tree is recognized as dying and is putting out shoots in a desperate effort to proliferate before it goes under. So that's a good sign. If you see those, be alert, and you might even want to contact one of us or report it to vtinvasives.org. Take a picture, and we'll check it out and get in touch with you. Anyone else want to add to that?
If you're a bird watcher, a pair of binoculars would be handy. And in fact, when we did our roadside surveys, that's all our staff were using binoculars because oftentimes EAB starts up in the top of the tree. So we were all having to use binoculars in order to do that initial detection. Looks like we had a couple of...
There was a question about what specifically can I do if it's...
Oh, right.
Yeah, so I'll take that one. If it's a high-value tree and a high-value location, and it's still healthy, there is insecticide treatments that are available that can kill EAB in the tree. We do have a fact sheet in the back that talks about the recommendations for pesticide treatments. One thing a couple things I recommend that you should know is that if you are going to treat for EAB, it's a long-term commitment. It's done every other year and for a long time. And the recommendation that we're using is that the pesticide would need to be applied by an individual that has a certification from the Agency of Agriculture. So those things you want to know, and you can pick up the fact sheet on the back, but you can treat ash trees. Well, there are different application methods. There are spray, you can do soil drench. What we are recommended is a trunk injection because it has less impact on other species. So a systemic trunk injection.
Great. Next question. John, I guess.
I think I heard Nate say that the female doesn't really fly more than 100 yards from emergence to lay her eggs. If that's the case, would it make sense as a part of a slow the spread strategy to set up a few girdled trees in the vicinity of an infested area to try to trap the bugs as they head out? And also, what do you think about girdling plus injection of the insecticide so you have sort of a killer trap tree?
Yeah, those are good questions. And we didn't really talk about management at all, but certainly girdle trees are highly attractive to dispersing adults. So what we do sometimes in managing forests is sometimes we'll girdle a cluster of trees, and you can remove those after a year, but it attracts most of the females that are ovipositing. So you can actually delay the population growth. If you destroy those trees at the end of the summer, you can delay population growth in the area quite substantially for a long time. And that's very effective when you're trying to keep ash on the landscape as long as possible. So we could certainly design, the strategic placement of girdle trees in an area to not just monitor for emerald ash borer, but to use them as what we call population sinks, where it really draws them in, and you destroy that, and those don't get to spread anywhere. We've also done experiments with injecting trees and then girdling them a few weeks later, so they're really attractive, but they're like big poison trees. And those do a good job as well. The only downside with those is that it's like a one-season option or one-season tool, right? So then those trees end up being destroyed. Eventually, after a year or two, they start losing their effectiveness. And because insecticide is expensive, usually what I would want to do is I tend to inject trees that I want to keep on the landscape. And they're going to be poisonous to emerald ash borer for a long time. And then maybe a tree that maybe doesn't have quite as good a form or is going to have to be removed for some other reason, use that one as a trap tree and as a girdled tree that really affects the population growth. Using those hand in hand kind of works together and provides better area-wide management than using your insecticide resources on a tree that you're only going to have on a landscape for a little while. Yep.
Next question. Why don't we go here, and then the gentleman in the back, Danny.
So it seems like most pests or parasites are smart enough to not kill off their host. And if this is killing off 99.9% of the ash trees, I'm just curious about, from a evolutionary development standpoint, why are they that destructive of their own host? But also, are there biocontrols? Are there any? Do they have predators that could be supported? It sounds like woodpeckers, but maybe somebody else.
Sounds like it's Nate again. Good thing we got that.
Yeah. So those are good questions. And I guess I'll hit the biocontrol one first, and that is that woodpeckers are by far our number one most effective biological control for emerald ash borer. Especially in a girdled tree, if we leave it up, we girdle it in the spring. It's effective all summer long, and then the woodpeckers really start going after those late instar larvae and pre-pupa of emerald ash borer late in the fall. So usually about hunting season, kind of October, November time frame, when those larvae are all getting to a mature stage, and the woodpeckers start really foraging for food. And they will revisit that same tree over and over every day, all winter long. So by early spring, like March or early April, you can have more than 90% of those EAB will have been eaten by woodpeckers. So that's really effective. We also have a lot of Asian parasitoids that have been approved, little wasps that either go and lay their eggs in emerald ash borer eggs or in the larvae. And some of those have limitations with the thickness of the bark that they can penetrate going after emerald ash borer larvae. And we try to get those established, but I guess the jury's still out as to what kind of effect they can have over the long term. I think in the aftermath forests, when populations of emerald ash borer are lower, I think parasitoids that are established will have more of an impact than they do in the initial wave of the emerald ash borer invasion. Because emerald ash borer population growth is really, really remarkable. And you get this wave of emerald ash borer and very high beetle numbers being produced out of all these large diameter overstory ash trees that we have. So they're just producing millions of adult beetles. And parasitoids can't respond to that degree very effectively. But we have both native and exotic parasitoids now that are available for release. Your first question is why is the insect killing its host? It seems like a bad idea. And it's true, and the reason is, in this case, is because emerald ash borer co-evolved with Asian ash species, and it doesn't kill those species in Asia. When you bring it over here and introduce it to our North American ash species, they haven't co-evolved, and actually our ash don't even recognize that they're being attacked until the density of ash borer is so high that it's too late to do anything. And we get the same problem with other insects. Something like bronze birch borer here is a very secondary pest, only affects birch trees if they get really stressed. And then you'll find them attack birch trees. But you take that same insect and take it to Europe and introduce it to European birch trees, and it's like emerald ash borer to the birch trees over there. It destroys those birch trees. So it's not that the insect has a great plan not to kill its host in Asia, but over here it just is like a glutton for the ash and it's destroying them.
Great, thank you. And gentleman in the back.
We're in the just outside the Montpelier red area, in the so-called high-risk area. What questions should we be asking of firewood suppliers and mulch suppliers? Normally, we have a lot of neighbors that some in the red zone, some just outside, who buy from the same firewood supplier.
The questions you'll want to ask your firewood supplier is there going to be any ash in the wood that's going to be delivered? Because the other species of firewood are safe. If there is ash, was it harvested within the infested zone? Do you buy green wood? Do you buy kiln-dried wood? What's the typical?
It's always green wood so far.
Okay, so those are good questions to ask for sure. Because heat-treated wood has killed any pests that are, if it's been properly heat treated, it's killed any pests that are in that wood. But asking if there is ash in it and if any of the ash was harvested within the infested zone. Because we've learned that, and thanks to Nate's input to our recommendations and things, that the ash borer can survive in split-dried, air-dried firewood for well over a year, right? Is that correct? Well over a year. And still emerge. So you can have wood that you think is safe because ash firewood that you think is safe because it's set out. It's safe to burn. It's actually a way to get rid of the insect, but you want to know that you're not ordering it if you're outside there. You're doing just what we'd like you to do by asking that question if your wood might come from that area. So are there other considerations that I haven't covered?
Mulch. Is mulch a risk?
Well, if mulch has been...
I was going to say, the mulch we get is just a hauler. We just call a local guy out, maybe a neighbor, and say, we'd like some mulch of this sort. He goes away and mulch. So there's no direct path to the origin.
Well, and of course, nowadays people tend to make mulch out of all kinds of different products and color it and things like that. So you probably don't know. But if going back to that same thing that Tony talked about, that small diameter, that less than inch on two sides, as long as it's ground fine, then there's no chance of the EAB surviving in the mulch. And is that just? I want to again confirm that with the folks that's as long as the mulch is under that size, then the borer can't survive in it. So.
And I would also mention that we are, not only reaching out to you folks, forest landowners, homeowners, but we have this same outreach effort going with loggers, with sawmills, with firewood processors. So we're trying to share this slow the spread recommendations with them so that they're voluntarily complying with our recommendations, so that they aren't moving firewood out of that infested zone, that they recognize the risk that plays, and hopefully they're going to be ethical and not doing that. I think you had a question.
In terms of identifying the telltale signs of the emerald ash borer, are they really specific? I mean, I've seen woods where they've had that worm caricature. So is it specific to the emerald ash borer? And you had mentioned there's other wannabe insects that look like the emerald ash borer. So is there ways to make that distinction, or are the resources available to help identify those distinctions?
Yeah, so on VT invasives, and Emily's going to find that for us, how to identify EAB. There are, hopefully the pictures of the native lookalikes. There's the lookalikes right there.
Some of them don't look alike.
But we get them all. We get them all. And secondly, do you have one picture of the galleries? Because I don't know we've projected that anywhere. The galleries are pretty distinctive. The thing is, if emerald ash borer is crowded with its friends in the same log, then it'll start looking for any place underneath the bark it can make a gallery. But if it has room to make the gallery it wants to, it will make the gallery that Emily is going to show you very shortly. The bark is really, it's a bright orange usually. There's better ones.
I think keep going. There you go.
We keep talking about how difficult it is to recognize emerald ash borer, and it's not just difficult for those who haven't seen it. It's difficult for those who have seen it, and it's difficult for foresters who are really familiar with trees. And standing right next to a tree that we know has emerald ash borer, I've talked with foresters and say, what am I supposed to look at that looks any different than all the other trees? And so it's something that takes a lot of patience, a lot of looking back at the resources, and just patience and waiting for a sign to basically show itself in some cases.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, it seemed like your first question, you were asking about that serpentine gallery. Do you see it in other kinds of wood? And is it emerald ash borer, or is this just specific to emerald ash borer? And it is not specific to emerald ash borer. So a lot of times you'll go into a forest and find like an old aspen or something that's dead and on the ground, and you'll see an old serpentine. That's not emerald ash borer. That's another buprestid that has a similar larval gallery. But if it's in ash, the only thing that's going to be is emerald ash borer. So, and they're very specific. They only go after ash trees, and also in some spots, in parts of Ohio, they found it in white fringe tree, which is a plant from the southeastern U.S., but it's sold sometimes as an ornamental, and maybe in people's yards. But we haven't. That seems like a very secondary host. It's attacked white fringe tree in Ohio in certain places, but we've gone in other places where we've known emerald ash borer populations have been really, really high and should have attacked these things, and we've gone back to like botanical gardens and searched through, and we can't find it on any of the white fringe tree there. So it seems like a very secondary host, but ash trees, very susceptible.
I was just, from a municipality standpoint, I know you're the resource for municipalities, and working with the Regional Planning Commission, working with those communities and the road foremen and the management plans and that type of thing. I know the state's gone out and met with some of the transportation advisory committees and stuff, so we appreciate that effort.
Yes, that's my territory, so if anyone has questions about municipalities, feel free to contact me. We are here to support you on that.
Additional questions? Mary?
If a tree is treated with the injection of the pesticide and it kills the larvae, if a woodpecker eats those larvae, will it get sick?
Why didn't I?
Yeah.
I thought I was going to get that one. I got nervous.
So that's a good question, because woodpeckers are such a great biological control. You don't want a bunch of dead woodpeckers around because you've treated a tree. And that's a frequently asked question in areas where we do a lot of treating of ash trees, and the answer is no. First of all, you're not injecting a lot of active chemical into the tree. And this one of the chemicals, emamectin benzoate, is very, very effective at killing emerald ash borer at low densities of the chemical. So it's like parts per million within the tree. So it's not like you have a dead larvae that the woodpeckers are going after that is full of like a toxic chemical. So we haven't found any evidence that it's affecting bird populations at all, which has been really great because we can use the two things hand in hand. And actually, it's probably on the VT Invasives website, and it's certainly on the emeraldashborer.info website. There are publications about frequently asked questions and how this will, affect other wildlife and things like that, and that's all available, and you can read more on that.
Just a quick follow-up. That's the chemical that Nate recommended, the emamectin benzoate. That is what we are recommending because of it's not as toxic to other species. The ones that are available to homeowners are neonicotinoids that we know have an impact on pollinators, and the application is based on soils, which has a broader range of impact. So that's why we're recommending one that we're recommending, and that it has to be applied by a certified applicator.
Additional questions? Yes, Vic.
As a landowner and maybe a large landowner and a person that does their own logging and their own firewood, I'm not the only one. There's a sense of frustration on our part because we can't get any clear answers, and I think the answer is to, like you said, go to your consultant forester, but they don't know. They can't come up with a plan. And it's not just one forester. There's not a lot of clear direction here on what's going to happen. We're coming from a point of right now that I've been told as many as 90% of those ash trees are going to die. They're going to be gone.
And more.
And more. Okay. So,
And are you in that infested zone, Vic? Are you in that?
The map that's on the map, I went last week and I called my county forester and I tried to do everything right. And I went to the map and it looks like I am. And I don't have, a majority of my trees are pine, but I do have a few ash, and I've tried to save them for 40 years. I've tried to grow them for 40 years, and So, yeah, I think if somebody could give us a little more from a logging point now, the feds have got us quarantined. We're a state that's quarantined. But the state is only worried about that area right around Montpelier, Plainfield. As long as you cut firewood and stay in that, I think on yours it's bright red and then a pink or orange colored. It's not the
Emily's
same
going to
as
bring it
that.
up here.
It's not the same as that egg there. So if you stay in that area, you can, you know, this gentleman over here said something about firewood from his firewood supplier, and he's very close. As long as you stay in that area, everything is legal, right? Everything's okay with firewood. But what if I have logs? Can I ship them to Hardwick? Can I go to the plant up there in Hardwick and or the log yard, the log buyer? Can I go up there and will they take those logs?
So you're inside the infested zone.
I'm right on the edge. I'm in Middlesex.
Yeah, so he's in the yellow zone.
I'm in the yellow zone.
And I'm colorblind, so I don't know when we're going to.
I think it's important to clarify, this whole area, red plus yellow, is the infested area.
Right.
So if the recommendations, the slow the spread recommendations that Sam referred to, refers to both areas. The area that's red is an area that we expect has some level of infestation within it. The area in the yellow is a high-risk area, and it is likely that there is expansion of emerald ash borer into that area in some parts of it, and will be further expansion in the very near future. And so all the slow the spread recommendations apply to this whole area.
So if you're going to harvest ash logs on your property and you want to take them outside the infested area, we're recommending that you follow the optimal practices, which would be to wait to move those logs until October 1st, or be done by April 30th. Okay, and so we want you to communicate if you're going to do that. We want you to communicate with the purchaser of those logs. Let them know I'm harvesting ash logs within the infested zone, so they know when they come in the yard that they can segregate them, or that they're handling them.
The price goes down automatically?
No. But if for some reason you had to harvest or transport those logs in the flight season, then it becomes even more critical. We're recommending that you don't do that, but some people have to do it, and that when those logs arrive somewhere, we want them to be treated properly, and those treatment recommendations are outlined here in this document, and there's a treatment document as well. That means they're debarked immediately. The bark is either burned or ground immediately. And so we've been doing that outreach to the mills, and the log yards know about that too. And it's a matter of initiating that communication that starts that sequence of events, so they know what to do if your logs arrive there. But like I said, the optimal practice is to delay moving them until after October 1.
Okay, but back to the firewood. Now, you can do firewood as long as you stay in the yellow and the red area?
The firewood is okay to move within there, but there's one other caveat to all this that we haven't talked about too, is visibly infested wood. If you have ash, logs, firewood, any ash product that is visibly infested, then the human eye. If you see.
I'm sure one of these people here would be a lot better at it than myself. You know, I could say, geez, I don't know.
If it's that bad, you'll know.
What's that?
If it's that bad, you'll know.
We'll remember you were here.
Yeah. Visibly moving, at the bottom of this sheet, the last line on the table is we want you to leave it on site or treat it on site or treat as above in the recommendations. But if you're moving visibly infested ash outside the recommendations, the Agency of Ag does have a plant pest enforcement statute. You can.
What's outside the recommendations?
These recommendations.
Outside that yellow area.
Not following these recommendations and moving that wood outside that area.
I don't have a problem
You don't want to move it outside the infested area. So.
You had asked about a straight answer on management recommendations, and one of the great punts of any forester is the right thing depends. And I already mentioned the variables that that may play a factor, but there are some kind of touchstones that you can use to say, if I check these boxes, I'm probably doing okay. And doing okay means I'm maintaining some ash on the landscape. We talked about ash having some resistance. We're not going to keep ash in our forest unless we keep some ash in the woods. So keep ash in the woods. It doesn't mean don't cut any ash, but keep some ash standing. Let it regenerate. Leave some there to get tested by the emerald ash borer. Maintain a diversity of species. We lose species because of things like this. If you're regenerating or growing a diversity of species, that's going to contribute to a healthy forest. So do those things. Control invasive plants in your forest land in places where ash trees are going to die and invasive plants are established in the understory. The death of those ash trees is going to grow invasive plants, honeysuckle, buckthorn, things like that, as opposed to a next forest. So that's another thing you can do. Outside of the infested area, maintaining the value of the ash. Don't pull the trigger on cutting that ash too early if you're not in close proximity to a known infestation. But again, I think maintaining diversity of species, controlling invasive plants, maintaining ash on the landscape, and just focusing on long-term vigor and health of the forest, you can't go wrong. And so I do think that we haven't done this before. There's a lot of foresters who are grappling with how to balance the variables, and so I'm not surprised that people are scratching their heads on this. But you know, this is here, and it's going to do its thing in the woods. And I think if we can do our best to respond appropriately, we won't have any regrets on it.
And we do have a brochure on the table for forest managers for recommendation. One more question, then we have one more presentation. Yeah.
And as I sat down, I looked at this recommendation. If it's in the flight season and it's visibly infested, we want you to leave it on the site where it was harvested. So I said you could move it within the infested area, but not during the flight season if it's visibly infested. So.
All right, this gentleman.
I'm a homeowner in Montpelier, which has been obviously targeted, but I'm slightly distressed to see that all of the folks involved in this seem to want to keep it a secret as to where the trees are that are infected. It's like HIPAA in the medical field, for crying out loud. If I've got a bad tree, I want my neighbors to know I got a bad tree, and I better damn well take care of it. And I expect my neighbors to. And I hope that because when you guys spot it, you're smart enough to go out just a little bit further into the areas you think that there's going to be further infection on and knock on doors. I mean, I have ash trees. I have a suspicion of one that looks a little sick, and the woodpeckers have seemed to be working on it. But I'm in the insurance business. I'm not in trees. I did get a degree in agriculture, but it had nothing to do with trees. I'm looking to you as professionals to realize that there ought to be no secrets in this thing, and if you've got a problem, we all got a problem. And we want to work at it and eliminate it. I been in Montpelier long enough to live through the elm trees. They all went. Way back 50 years ago when I first came to town. So I got to tell you, we have some beautiful ashes in Montpelier, and if we have a way to protect them, I think we ought to all join hands, and you ought to be pretty straightforward when somebody has an infected tree.
Are you giving that one to me? He was looking at me. I think I'm getting it because I work with municipalities and you're a homeowner. And Because you're in Montpelier and you're in the red zone, we are assuming that that area is infested and that we should be moving forward, that those trees are infested. Now, what you want to do with your individual ash trees, you still want to monitor them and make a decision on whether or not it's a tree you want to treat for protection long term, or if it's going to be a tree that you're going to want to remove down the line because it doesn't have high value for you. So you should be making those decisions now. The city of Montpelier has a wonderful tree board, and the city forester are looking at what they're going to do within the city. And I know they've been doing outreach to landowners as well, to homeowners. So we are all in this together.
Yeah, and you raise a good point, but at the same time, we do need to protect the property owner's identity to some extent, because we don't want people to not contact us. So, if we start spreading around, well, it's that individual in the town of Orange and that individual in town of Plainfield, and then everybody's staring at them whenever they go down to the local store, how are we going to get more people coming forward that think that they have infested trees? So we're really trying to, I think, and the fact is that when you actually see that tree that's been infested, we know that it's probably the EAB has been there for 3 or 4 years. So the fact is, just because it's on that tree, on that landowner's property, doesn't mean that it isn't on the adjacent property. We just haven't necessarily found it. That's why we're doing this zone and radius. Barbara, you want to, anything else?
Could I just make a remark?
Yeah.
You mentioned knocking on doors, and I had to laugh because the first place we found it was way out in the woods, and there were no neighbors to talk to about it. So just to inject a little humor into the situation here.
Well, we do have land records.
No, we found the landowners.
The other thing I think, is that Barbara did tell you that the way the map was created is we have a known infestation, and we did a 5-mile radius around that. So you mathematicians in the room could pretty much figure it out on your own. We're not going to tell you, but that is a possibility.
I think that the potential, if we distributed the known infestations, the points, and it were to have a major impact in assessing risk, then there might be significant value. The fact is, there are a lot of places we know that it exists in a lot of places that we aren't aware of. And to suggest that it is any more risky right here or right here than it is right here is probably a misrepresentation of the level of risk. And so what we're saying to folks who are in this red area, make your decisions now. This area is likely infested, and folks should act on it.
Can I know you asked for one more question, but I'd just like to make a comment. Sorry. It seems to me that from what I've heard tonight, and you all are a lot smarter in this area than I am, your basic ask ought to be, if anybody has an ash tree that they don't care about, we'd like you to girdle it and collect any EABs that you can and kill that tree within 2 years. We need really actionable information because we don't understand what we're supposed to do in the best possible world. And you all are trying to come to consensus across a whole bunch of governmental organizations. And if there's a best case we wish this would do the best thing, it would be great to figure out how to hear that on our side. And that may not be the right thing, but boy, that's what I think I just heard.
I guess so. We have reached a consensus, and the consensus is the very most helpful thing that you can do is slow the spread. So the effort that we've put into the recommendations is because We look at the map of how emerald ash borer spreads and what's happened in other places, and that's the advantage of being the 32nd state to be infested, is we can look at what's happened elsewhere. And the consensus we reached is the most helpful thing that you can do is ask questions. I'm a landowner. How should I deal with my firewood? I'm a tree service. What do I do with the waste wood? My tree was just pruned. Is it okay if I give the pruning stuff to my neighbors? Well, where do they live? Where do you live? The most helpful thing you can do is slow the spread yourself. Tell other people about how to slow the spread. And I guess that is our consensus.
Great, thank you, Barbara. We've got one more individual that's been sitting very quietly in the back of the room, and we'd like to let Commissioner Snyder of FPR kind of give some closing comments and a little summary of perhaps what he's heard.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Who wants me to stand in front of him here? Nice, Emily. You can count on Emily. Michael Snyder, Commissioner of Forest, Parks, and Recreation. Quickly, before I forget, I want to acknowledge that Secretary Tebbets from the Ag Agency couldn't be here tonight. I know he's very interested. I want to acknowledge that he's got staff here and has been very helpful in leading this cooperative effort from the Ag side, which, as Steve mentioned very early on, is a shared responsibility that we have with the Ag Agency. So I'm Commissioner of FPR, have been for 7+ years, and I want you to know that it's really good to see you here from my perspective, and I think that's as Commissioner, but also because I'm a forester myself, a licensed forester, 30+ years of practice in Vermont, and I'm a landowner, forest landowner myself, and it really is good to see you here. Frankly, your questions are reassuring to me. Because it shows interest, and this is key. Your interest in all of this, in becoming informed, is actually quite key. And so it's heartening to see and to hear just show up and be interested, and then ask good questions, and they really have been. I guess I feel like listening. There's just so much good information that we're lucky to have access to. And so I'd ask you if you would, among, a bunch of government bureaucracies, but also world-class experts in their field, working right here with us. And so I'd ask you to join me in thanking this panel of experts once again for their dedication and commitment. Thank you. Thank you all. But more about you. Nate has been at this EAB thing since the very beginning, right? In graduate school in 2002, you were there, ground zero. And he's been there. And I think he made an enormously compelling and powerful point earlier, that this is about you and us. This insect has moved incredibly quickly across the eastern U.S., and we did it. The insect didn't really do it. So we really do need straight answers, and you deserve them, and I think we're giving them to you. And I think we have a consensus, and Barbara answered the question well about what are the actionable items. It's slow the spread, and it hasn't worked everywhere else. We're doing it a different way. We're doing it the Vermont way, and I'm extremely proud of the work, the thinking, the science that's been applied, and the experience. We base our decisions in science, and we're grounded in experience. I'm a forester. We take the long view. And I'm asking you to do the same, I guess. And you're showing your interest by being here. Becoming informed is absolutely critical. This isn't necessarily simple. There are a lot of interests and values. It's dynamic, and it's really quite new. We've learned an enormous amount, but there's much to come. So I guess no one said it. I'm going to say it. I like a man who wants a straight answer, and I think the straight answer here is don't be rash with your ash. I'm not just kidding. I mean, especially listening to your story. You're out there working, you're paying attention, you love this place, you've grown these trees for 40+ years. You can do this. As I understand it, Nate, any of you correct me if I'm wrong, once it's infested, it could be a couple, 3, 5 years before the tree is actually dead. You're paying attention, and you got time. You don't have to go out and liquidate those ash trees. Because this long view is about living through maybe a wave of mortality. With the aftermath? Lingering ash, sure, we're going to get hung up on 99% mortality. That's a scary figure. It should be. It's the most destructive forest insect pest we've ever experienced. But that's the first wave. I have a question. If you'll allow, I'd like to ask, and I'm guessing it's you again, Nate, what's the smallest size ash tree that is vulnerable to the insect? I'm getting at seedlings and saplings. How voracious is it there?
They'll easily kill anything 1 inch in diameter and larger. So, and I've found on a regular tree, like a twig, the size of my pinky, from egg to adult, successful on a twig. And it's just amazing what they don't take much area to be successful.
So we're focused on the big trees, and that's reasonable. They can infest much smaller trees. We see a pulse of ash seed in the last several years. I noticed a lot of ash seedlings on the ground. I look there and think, okay, let's live through this first wave. It's going to be really bad. We have preparedness plans for communities and homeowners. There's really good advice over here. But let's get through that. Keep hope alive for our friends the woodpeckers. Let's give it up for the woodpeckers. Parasitoid wasps present some other biological control, hope. Some semblance and reason for thinking of genetic resistance, potentially breeding programs to enhance that and implement it. I think there's a lot of reasons to be thinking beyond. Let's deal with the emergency that it is without being rash. Read the guidance, reach out, avail yourselves of this incredible expertise, and we have sort of the now and then the longer term. And I'm asking you to think that way. Again, this is moving by people without even realizing it. We've clamped down on that in a way that I think, again, I'm proud of this sort of Vermont approach. Slow the spread, let's be realistic, and focus on those best practices. We have excellent guidance and best practices for a range of considerations and interests. It's not cookie cutter. You get to have your desires out there with your land and your trees. And we've got guidance for all of it. I'd ask you to be aware of it and take advantage of those good options and best practices. This is about slowing the spread and, in my view, keeping hope alive. With that, I will, again, close by thanking you for just demonstrating your concern and interest by showing up on a particularly beautiful summer Vermont evening. It says a lot. And I hope that you share my sense that we're lucky to have the dedication, commitment, expertise that's here, listening and trying to put together the best possible plan. And again, it isn't going to happen without you. So we actually really do need to do this with you, and we appreciate that you're willing to try to do it with us. Thank you.
Yeah, before everybody departs, I just want to recognize Gwen and Meredith that are in the back of the room. They work for UVM Extension and do a lot of our outreach and education efforts, and thanks, Scott, for doing the recording. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks, sir.
F-bombs. That's my goal.
You change that.
It's a low bar.